The commander had learned long ago that silence was the only language the battlefield truly understood. In the chaos of war, words rarely mattered. Steel, powder, and blood spoke louder than anything else. That morning, silence wrapped around the forward observation post like a shroud, only interrupted by the distant thump of mortars and the occasional crack of rifles echoing across the valley. Colonel Marcus Hale stood with his arms folded, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the jagged ridgelines that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the hard Afghan sun. His unit had been stationed here for months, holding ground against insurgent fighters who seemed to rise like ghosts out of caves and shadows, striking with vicious precision before vanishing into the rocks. He was not a man given to superstition, yet even he could not help but feel that this place breathed hostility. Beneath him, the forward base was restless. Soldiers moved with mechanical discipline, maintaining weapons, tightening gear, muttering to each other in voices too low to disturb the stillness. They all knew what Hale knew, that the insurgents had a habit of testing the perimeter at dawn, probing for weaknesses. And though his men were good, disciplined, and battle-hardened, the enemy here was clever, using the land itself as a weapon. High ridges made for perfect ambush sites, deep gullies for quick escapes. It was a chess match against opponents who had been playing it for generations. Hale lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. He thought about the patrol from 2 weeks ago, ambushed in a dry riverbed. 4 dead. 2 wounded. The insurgents had melted away before the air support even arrived. The memory lingered like a bitter taste in his mouth. He had commanded men through countless operations, but here the war was not fought in decisive clashes. It was fought in attrition, in patience, in outlasting an enemy who seemed to know the terrain as intimately as his own skin. The commander had grown tired of writing letters to mothers, to wives, to fathers who would never hear their children's voices again. But in the silence of that morning, Hale sensed something different. His attention turned toward a figure lying prone near the edge of the ridge where the observation post overlooked the valley. She was smaller than the others, almost dwarfed by the massive rifle resting on its bipod in front of her. The Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifle looked oversized in her hands, a beast designed for long-range death, heavy and brutal. Yet she held it with a familiarity that spoke not of intimidation but of mastery. Her name was Sergeant Lena Carter, one of the most reserved soldiers Hale had ever commanded. She rarely spoke, never boasted, and seemed to live in the shadow of her own silence. At first he had underestimated her. Most did. Her quiet demeanor and almost delicate frame betrayed none of the steel she carried inside. But Hale had learned slowly to watch her the way he watched the ridges, carefully and with respect. Lena had arrived 6 months earlier, pulled from another unit after word of her skill began to filter upward through the ranks. At first, Hale thought it exaggeration, the sort of myth soldiers built around anyone who stood out. But over time, her results left no room for doubt. Time and again she had spotted the enemy long before anyone else. Time and again her rifle had spoken from distances others considered impossible. Yet she carried herself with no arrogance, no hunger for recognition. She did not crave the respect she earned, she seemed indifferent to it, as though her only dialogue was with the scope and the wind. Now, as she lay still against the dust, the sun slowly climbing above the horizon, Hale could almost feel her mind narrowing, focusing, locking onto something invisible to the rest of them. Through his binoculars he scanned the opposite ridges but saw nothing but rock and shadow. Still, he had learned enough to trust her instincts. If she was here, motionless, eyes locked through her scope, then something was coming. Minutes crawled by, and the silence deepened until even the murmurs of the camp below died away. The valley stretched out in muted browns and grays, the kind of landscape that played tricks on the eyes. Heat shimmered off stone, dust shifted with unseen breezes, shadows lengthened and shrank. Hale kept his binoculars steady, searching, but still saw nothing. Then he heard it. A sound so soft it might have been imagined. Lena clicking the adjustment on her scope. 1, 2, 3 tiny clicks. She exhaled, her breath slow and deliberate, then stilled. The commander found himself holding his own breath without realizing it, mirroring her rhythm as though the entire world had narrowed down to that rifle, that scope, and her steady hands. "What do you see?" he whispered, though he knew better than to expect an answer. Lena never answered when the rifle was against her shoulder. She only spoke when it was over. Hale's eyes strained across the expanse of rock until at last, there. A flicker of movement. Barely perceptible but real. The faint outline of a man shifting against the backdrop of stone nearly 2 miles away. The commander's pulse quickened. The distance was absurd. Even with the Barrett, even with perfect conditions, It was beyond the range most snipers dared attempt. Yet Lena's finger rested against the trigger guard, steady as stone, as though nothing about the shot concerned her. Hale did not speak again. He simply watched. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat heavy in Hale's chest. The wind whispered across the valley. Dust stirred in lazy spirals. Somewhere below, a soldier coughed. Then Lena squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered like a cannon, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, dust erupting around her position. Hale's binoculars tracked the distant figure, and he saw the impossible. A man collapsed backward, struck down by a force he never even heard. 2 miles. More. The commander felt his breath leave him in a rush, awe flooding through him in a way he had not experienced in years. Lena did not move. She did not smile. She simply chambered another round and lowered her cheek to the stock once more, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Hale's hands trembled slightly as he lowered his binoculars. For months he had watched her in silence, uncertain whether the rumors were true, uncertain whether her calm was born of arrogance or detachment. But in that moment he understood. This was no myth. This was no exaggeration. She had just set a record that would echo through the annals of warfare. A kill at 3,247 meters. Unthinkable. Impossible. And yet she had done it with the same quiet grace she carried in every movement, as though death at that distance was just another conversation between her and the rifle. For the first time in years, Colonel Hale felt something stir inside him, a mixture of pride, awe, and unease. Because now he realized that the war was no longer the same. The battlefield had shifted, its silence broken not by noise, but by a single shot that had rewritten what men believed possible. The shot echoed longer in memory than it did in the valley. Within seconds of Lena's trigger pull, the forward base came alive with voices, movement, and disbelief. Soldiers scrambled from their posts to see what had happened, some climbing onto sandbags for a better look, others scanning the ridgeline with binoculars and scopes trying to confirm what they had just heard. For most, the report of the Barrett was an unmistakable sound, a crack like thunder, a reminder that death had just been delivered from afar. But what stunned them now was not the sound but the distance. The murmurs spread like ripples in water. "Christ, did she hit something that far out?" one soldier whispered. "No way," another replied, though his voice carried little conviction. They all knew Lena's reputation, even if she herself never spoke of it. In a place where fear and bravado fed off each other, stories became currency. Men told tales to make sense of war, to carve meaning out of the senseless. And Lena Carter's name had begun weaving its way into those tales, half legend, half reality. But even the most elaborate rumors had never stretched this far. Colonel Hale stood with his binoculars still pressed to his face, as if afraid to lower them lest the vision vanish into fantasy. The body lay sprawled against the stone, distant yet unmistakably lifeless. There was no mistaking it. No argument possible. It was a confirmed kill at more than 3 kilometers. The kind of shot that belonged in textbooks, the kind of distance spoken of in hushed tones in sniper schools. And she had made it look effortless. Lena herself remained still, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She adjusted her scope, checked the chamber, shifted slightly against the bipod. To her it seemed no different than swatting a fly. The silence around her was not the silence of reverence or ceremony, but of routine. Hale studied her, wondering what thoughts, if any, passed through her mind. Did she feel pride? Relief? Or was this, to her, no more than a mathematical problem solved with steel and gunpowder? The commander descended from the ridge slowly, his boots crunching against the stone. He could hear the soldiers talking below, their voices rising with a mixture of awe and disbelief. 3 clicks, it's not even possible. She doesn't miss, man. I told you. Hell, she's not human. Hale reached the gathering and their voices died off as they noticed him. Soldiers stiffened, some trying to mask the excitement in their expressions. Respect for the commander was strong, but even stronger was their fear of saying too much in his presence. Hale's face betrayed nothing. Inside, however, he felt the same awe gnawing at him. "Report," he ordered curtly. A spotter nearby spoke up. "Confirmed hit, sir. Target neutralized at approximately 3,200 meters. No further movement." Hale nodded once, then turned his gaze back to the ridge where Lena remained prone, her silhouette framed against the sky. It struck him then just how solitary she was. Even surrounded by comrades, she seemed apart, as though her existence on the battlefield was its own separate dimension. Later, in the commander's quarters, Hale sat at the small metal desk that served as his office and stared at the after-action reports. Numbers, distances, conditions, all neatly transcribed by diligent sergeants. The ink on the page seemed almost absurd in its simplicity, as though a world record could be captured by sterile lines of text. Yet here it was. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, the weight of the war pressing on him as always. But now, interwoven with that burden, was a question he could not shake. Who exactly was Lena Carter? He had read her file, of course. Born in Kentucky. Rural upbringing. Father a hunter, mother a schoolteacher. Joined the army at 18. Trained in marksmanship early, excelling far beyond her peers. Selected for sniper school. Deployed to Iraq, then Afghanistan. The file painted her as exceptional but not extraordinary. Plenty of soldiers had perfect scores on the range. Plenty could claim hunting backgrounds or military parents. Yet none of them had done what she just did. It wasn't just talent. Talent alone did not explain that shot. It was something else, something colder, sharper, honed in silence. Hale wondered whether she carried some part of herself hidden from the rest of them, a depth no one could reach. That night, as darkness fell and the base settled into its uneasy rhythm of watch rotations and radio chatter, Hale found himself walking the perimeter. The desert air was cool, the stars sharp against the black sky. He came across Lena sitting by herself on a stack of crates, her rifle resting across her lap. She was cleaning it methodically, hands steady, movements precise. She did not look up when he approached. "Good work today," Hale said finally. "Thank you, sir." Her voice was quiet, almost flat. She did not stop her work, did not break the rhythm of her careful motions. "You realize what you did out there?" "Yes, sir. That was beyond anything I've ever seen." She paused then for just a fraction of a second, her hands resting on the rifle. Then she resumed cleaning. "It was the shot that needed to be taken," she said simply. Hale studied her profile in the faint light. There was no arrogance, no smile of satisfaction. Just calm certainty, as though she had merely completed a duty no different from filling out a form. He felt a strange unease creep into him. A soldier proud of such an achievement might have been easier to understand. Pride, after all, was human. But Lena carried none of it. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "No, sir." "Most would have," he pressed. She finally looked up at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Most aren't me." The words were not boastful. They were simply truth, spoken without ornament. Hale nodded slowly, though her answer lingered with him long after he walked away. In the days that followed, word of the shot spread far beyond the base. Higher command took notice. Messages came down through channels, confirming that Lena's kill had set a new record. It would be logged, analyzed, reported in training manuals. Her name was already beginning to circulate in places she would never see. Yet she remained as she always was, quiet, withdrawn, almost indifferent. To the soldiers she was becoming myth. To command she was an asset. But to Hale she was becoming a question he could not answer. He had watched countless men under fire. Some broke, some hardened, some found meaning in camaraderie, others drowned in despair. But Lena? She was none of these things. She was like the silence of the valley itself, vast, unmoved, impossible to truly grasp. Hale began to wonder whether that silence was her strength, or her curse. White heavy checkmark word count, 127 words. The days after the record shot settled into a rhythm both ordinary and extraordinary. On the surface, the base carried on as it always did. Patrols went out, supply convoys came in under escort, radio chatter filled the airwaves with codes and coordinates. Men played cards in the downtime, passed jokes back and forth, polished their weapons until the metal gleamed. Yet beneath it all, an undercurrent had formed. Every soldier knew they were serving alongside someone who had just rewritten the limits of their profession. The knowledge changed them, subtly but surely. Hale could feel it when he walked among them. Soldiers carried themselves differently, a little taller, a little sharper, as though Lena's achievement had cast a protective shadow over them all. If she could kill at over 3 kilometers, then perhaps they weren't so vulnerable in this hostile land. Perhaps their fragile foothold in the mountains wasn't quite so fragile after all. Some even began to joke nervously that the enemy would think twice before showing their heads within miles of the base. Yet behind the laughter there was a real shift. Morale was no longer limping forward, it was marching. But not all shifts were comforting. Hale noticed the other side of it as well. A few soldiers looked at Lena differently now, with a kind of wary reverence, as though she wasn't one of them anymore but something separate, something more than human. Others avoided her entirely, as if afraid that her silence was contagious, or that her rifle spoke with a language they couldn't understand. It was the strange duality of legends. They inspired, but they also isolated. Lena herself seemed untouched by it all. She carried on with her duties exactly as before, cleaning her rifle, rotating watch shifts, eating quietly at the mess tent. She never mentioned the shot, never acknowledged the whispers. If anything, she seemed to shrink further into herself, as though the weight of recognition was something she did not wish to carry. Hale, however, could not let it go. The shot haunted him, not in a way that tormented but in a way that demanded answers. He found himself revisiting her file again at night, studying the dry lines of text for some clue. It all seemed so normal. A girl from a rural county in Kentucky, growing up in a modest household. Her father, a hunter and part-time mechanic, had taught her how to handle a rifle before she was 12. That part he understood. Many rural families lived by hunting seasons, their children growing up with firearms as naturally as city kids grew up with bicycles. But the file mentioned something else that stuck with him: her father's reputation. He wasn't just a hunter. He was obsessive, a perfectionist, known to spend entire days in the woods teaching his daughter how to breathe, how to wait, how to let the world fall away until only the target remained. Hale pictured it, an adolescent girl lying prone in the damp Kentucky undergrowth, the air buzzing with insects, her father's voice low and steady behind her. "Don't rush, Lena. The deer doesn't care about your heartbeat. The wind doesn't care about your nerves. Breathe. Wait. Let the shot happen, don't force it." He imagined her stillness then, the same stillness she carried now, forged not by war but by the relentless patience of her father's lessons. Perhaps this was where it began. The file also noted competitions: small-town shooting matches, county fairs, regional tournaments. She had cleaned house every time, out shooting men twice her age, winning trophies that ended up gathering dust in her mother's attic. By 17 she was already known in certain circles, though she herself never sought recognition. She joined the army almost as if it was the natural next step, carrying her gift into a place where it could be sharpened, formalized, weaponized. Her instructors at sniper school had written glowing evaluations. One, Hale noticed, had scribbled in the margin: "She doesn't think like the others. She thinks like the bullet." Hale stared at those words longer than he cared to admit. What did it mean to think like the bullet? To surrender one's humanity so completely to the mechanics of the shot? Was that what he had seen on the ridge? While Hale wrestled with these questions, the enemy wrestled with a new fear of their own. Scouts reported that insurgents were no longer approaching the perimeter with the same boldness as before. Recon drones spotted fewer gatherings in the open. Radio intercepts carried fragments of panic, talk of an invisible death. A whisper passed through fighters like smoke. Hale listened to some of the translated chatter one evening. "The long rifle," one voice said. "She sees us even when we are dust." Another muttered, "We cannot cross the valley. She will take us before we are close." It was the ultimate compliment, Hale supposed, the enemy reshaping their tactics because of one soldier's presence. Yet it also painted a target on her back. He knew how insurgents operated. They adapted quickly. If fear couldn't keep them away, vengeance would drive them forward. Sure enough, within a week, a patrol returning to base brought back word that a bounty had been announced on the mysterious sniper. Posters, crudely printed, had been seen in a nearby village. A woman's silhouette with a rifle and a promise of riches for anyone who could deliver her death. The men joked about it in the barracks, but Hale saw the tension in their eyes. They knew the insurgents would throw everything they had to claim such a prize. That night Hale called Lena into his quarters. She stood at attention in front of his desk, her posture rigid but calm, her rifle slung across her back as though it were part of her body. "You've heard the talk," Hale said. "Yes, sir. They're coming for you." "They've always been coming for all of us," she replied evenly. "This is different. You've changed the battlefield, Carter. You've rattled them and now they'll focus on you." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then it'll be easier to know where they'll come from." Hale leaned back, studying her. That cold certainty again. No fear, no hesitation. Part of him admired it. Another part of him wondered if she had anything left to fear at all. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked suddenly. "Think about what, sir?" "The lives you take." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes, something small, quick, gone before he could define it. She looked past him as if seeing something else entirely. Then her voice came, quiet as ever. "I think about the lives they'd take if I didn't." Hale nodded slowly. It was the perfect soldier's answer. Simple, utilitarian, free of sentiment. Yet he could not shake the feeling that there was more buried beneath it, a layer of thought or memory she would never share. After she left, Hale sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the weight of countless battles past and future. He realized then that Lena Carter was not just a sniper, not just a soldier. She was something rarer, something more dangerous. A person who had made herself into silence incarnate, as if she had merged with the land itself, patient and merciless. And now both friend and foe alike had begun to realize it. The enemy struck at dawn. It began with a probing volley of mortars, crude but effective, shells whistling down into the valley floor with explosions that rattled the base's perimeter walls. Dust rose in choking clouds. Alarms wailed, men rushed to defensive positions. Hale was on the command deck within seconds, barking orders into the radio, his voice sharp and clipped as he coordinated the response. But this attack felt different. The mortars weren't aimed to destroy, they were meant to draw eyes downward to keep the defenders busy. Hale knew the tactic well enough. He scanned the ridgelines, heart hammering, searching for the real threat. That was when he saw them, glimmers of movement on the high rocks, shapes advancing low and fast. Snipers. Counter-snipers. They had come hunting. Get Carter on the ridge. Hale snapped. By the time Lena arrived, the base was already under siege from multiple angles. Enemy fire cracked against the walls, bullets whining across the sandbags. Hale pointed toward the ridge, but she was already moving, sprinting low with her rifle hugged tight against her chest. She slid into position atop the observation post as if she'd been born there, bipod slamming into the stone, scope already searching. Targets? She asked, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Ridgeline, east side. They're hunting you, Hale said, crouching beside her. Then they're close enough, she replied simply. The first shot rang out an instant later. Not hers, the enemy's. A high-velocity round sparked against the stone inches from her head, shards of rock spraying into the air. Hale's gut clenched, but Lena didn't even flinch. She shifted slightly, adjusted her scope, and fired. Her rifle's roar drowned the battlefield for a heartbeat, and a distant figure toppled backward into the dust. Another round screamed past, so close Hale felt the hot whisper of its passage. He ducked instinctively, but Lena stayed as she was, eyes locked into the scope. She tracked, adjusted, fired again. Another body slumped, lifeless. The battle unfolded in seconds, a deadly chess game at distances that would have seemed impossible to most. Enemy snipers had chosen their positions carefully, using shadows, rocks, and the sun's glare to mask their approach. But Lena found them as though they carried lanterns on their backs. Each adjustment of her scope was deliberate, each breath measured. The rifle spoke, and men died before they even realized they had been seen. By the time the mortars ceased and the insurgent gunfire slackened, Lena had claimed 5 more kills. The counter-sniper team had been wiped out. The survivors melted back into the mountains, carrying their dead or leaving them to the vultures. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the ringing in Hale's ears and the murmurs of his men below. He looked at her then. She was lowering her rifle, ejecting the magazine, movements smooth and mechanical. No exhilaration. No relief. No trembling hands. Just routine, as if she had finished a training exercise. Hale realized his mouth was dry. You knew they'd come for you, he said. They had to, she replied. They almost got you. Her eyes flicked to him, steady and unwavering. Almost isn't enough. It was the kind of answer that left him unsettled because it was true. And yet, Hale couldn't shake the image of the round sparking against the stone inches from her head. Even the best could bleed. Even silence could be broken. That evening, the base carried a strange energy. Some soldiers were jubilant, retelling the clash with exaggeration, boasting of how their sniper had dismantled the enemy's best hunters. Others were quieter, shaken by the knowledge that the insurgents had come so close to claiming her life. Hale walked among them, listening, saying little. But when he looked toward the ridge where Lena's silhouette had once again returned to her solitary watch, he felt a knot in his chest he couldn't quite loosen. Later, in his quarters, Hale found himself staring at the map pinned to the wall. Red marks indicated enemy sightings, ambushes, attacks. A cluster of them ringed the valley. The enemy had begun to move differently. They were no longer striking at random. They were converging, focusing their attention on this base, on Lena. It was dangerous, because while her skill was extraordinary, she was still only one person. And every time she pulled the trigger, the enemy's obsession deepened. He was still studying the map when Lena entered, summoned by his order. She stood in the doorway, silent as ever, her presence filling the room without effort. Hale motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. You understand what today means? Hale said. Yes, sir. They won't stop. You've humiliated them. Every shot you fire makes you a bigger target. She tilted her head slightly. And every shot I fire keeps our men alive. Hale leaned forward, elbows on the desk. That's the dilemma, isn't it? Your gift saves lives, but it also draws danger like blood in the water. Lena didn't answer at first. She seemed to weigh his words, then finally said, Danger was already here, Colonel. The difference now is that they fear us. Her calm unnerved him. It wasn't bravado, he would have recognized that. It wasn't ignorance either. She knew the risks better than anyone. But there was something in her, some inner stillness that seemed to absorb fear and leave nothing behind. Hale wondered what kind of mind could carry that. What it cost her. That night he couldn't sleep. His dreams were filled with echoes of gunfire and the image of Lena's steady eyes behind the scope. He rose before dawn, pacing the perimeter, the cold air biting at his skin. When he reached the ridge, he found her already there as he knew he would. She was prone again, scanning the valley as if she hadn't moved since the day before. Do you ever stop? Hale asked quietly. She lowered her scope just enough to glance at him. Does the valley? The word struck him more deeply than he expected. He turned his gaze outward to the jagged horizon that seemed to stretch forever. The war was endless, the valley timeless, and Lena Carter, he realized with a chill, had made herself a part of it. As the sun crept over the peaks, its first light catching the metal of her rifle, Hale understood something he hadn't before. Lena wasn't simply fighting the enemy. She was waging war against the very notion of vulnerability. She had become silence, patience, inevitability. But he also knew that silence could not last forever. The enemy would come again, harder, more desperate. And one day they might succeed. For the first time since the war began, Colonel Hale found himself afraid, not of the enemy, but of what would be lost if they ever took her. The ambush came 3 days later. It began with what looked like routine enemy activity. Scouts spotted movement along a ravine to the north, the kind of probing advance the insurgents had used countless times before. A patrol was dispatched to investigate, 5 men moving in careful formation through the brittle scrub and dust. Hale monitored their progress from the command post, Lena lying prone beside him with her scope already trained on the far ridge. Something about it gnawed at him. The insurgents were too obvious, their movements clumsy, exposed. They wanted to be seen. Hale's instincts, honed over decades, told him this was no mere probing. This was bait. And then the trap snapped shut. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs, a blistering crossfire that cut into the patrol from both sides. Men dove for cover, shouting into their radios. The ambushers weren't just irregulars with AKs, these were trained fighters, disciplined, coordinated. Heavy machine guns barked from hidden nests, pinning the patrol in the open. RPGs screamed down into the ravine, the explosions shaking the ground. Hale was already on the radio, barking for support, calling artillery coordinates, demanding air cover. But it would take minutes to arrive, and his men didn't have minutes. They were pinned and dying. Then Lena spoke for the first time. I see them. Her voice was flat, calm, almost detached. She adjusted her scope, breath slow and measured. The Barrett roared and one of the machine gun nests went silent, its gunner thrown backward in a spray of dust. She shifted, fired again, another nest silenced. The patrol scrambled for cover, buying precious seconds. But the insurgents had prepared for her. The moment she fired, counter-sniper rounds cracked back across the ridge. Dust exploded near her head, bullets whining past. Hale's stomach clenched. They weren't just ambushing the patrol, they were baiting her. Pull back, he barked. But Lena didn't move. Her body was as still as the rocks beneath her, her fingers squeezing the trigger with surgical precision. Another shot. Another kill. She had spotted their counter-snipers, picking them off as though they'd been painted on glass. Yet the enemy had numbers. For every fighter she dropped, another emerged from the rocks. The firefight escalated, the ravine filling with the echo of gunfire, explosions, screams. Hale crouched beside her, torn between awe and fear. Each shot she took saved lives, but each shot also drew more fire toward her position. The patrol was still trapped, casualties mounting. Hale's radio crackled with frantic voices, men calling out wounded, calling for help. Lena's shots cut through the chaos, methodical, relentless. But she was one rifle against dozens. Hale knew it wasn't sustainable. Carter, he snapped. That's an order. Fall back. She didn't answer. She simply fired again, the recoil shaking her body. Hale felt anger surge in him, anger born of fear. He wanted to drag her off the ridge himself, to shake sense into her. But when he looked at her face he saw no disobedience, only inevitability. She wasn't ignoring him. She was beyond him, beyond orders, existing in that razor-thin space where the battle was decided by fractions of seconds and millimeters. At last, the howl of jet engines tore across the sky. An A-10 swept in low, its cannon roaring, tearing the cliffs apart in a storm of fire. The insurgents broke, scattering like insects under a boot. Artillery followed seconds later, smashing the ravine, drowning out all sound. When the smoke cleared, the patrol was bloodied but alive. 2 wounded, 1 critical, but they had survived. Thanks to her. Lena lowered her rifle at last, ejected the empty magazine, and rolled her shoulders as though she had just finished a long shift at a desk. Hale stood beside her, fists clenched, heart hammering. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said tightly. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "If I had pulled back they'd all be dead." The words cut through his anger. He wanted to shout at her, to remind her of discipline, of chain of command. But he couldn't. Because she was right. He had seen it. Her shots had kept the patrol alive long enough for support to arrive. Without her, the ravine would have been a slaughterhouse. He turned away, jaw tight. Command demanded order, obedience. But war demanded survival. And Lena Carter was survival incarnate. That night, the base was alive with talk again. Some called her a savior, others whispered that she was reckless, cursed even. The men of the patrol swore they owed her their lives. Yet Hale could not shake the unease that had settled deep in his bones. She wasn't reckless, no, that wasn't it. She was precise, deliberate. But she carried herself as if her own life was expendable, as if the only thing that mattered was the shot. He sat alone in his quarters long after midnight, staring at her file once more. There was nothing in the dry pages that explained the woman who had just stood her ground against an army. Nothing that explained the silence she carried, the way she seemed immune to fear, to exhaustion, even to orders. It was then that Hale realized his dilemma. Keeping her in the field was a double-edged sword. Her presence saved lives, inspired the men, struck terror into the enemy. But it also drew the insurgents closer, made her a target, and by extension made them all a target. Every day she stayed, the danger escalated. And yet, could he really pull her out? Could he bench the one soldier who could see death coming before it arrived, who could turn the tide with a single bullet? He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. Command was supposed to be about clarity, about making hard choices with firm resolve. But Lena Carter had introduced a paradox into his war. She was both their greatest weapon and their greatest liability. The following morning Hale walked the perimeter again. The sun was rising, painting the ridges gold. And there she was as always, prone on the ridge, her scope scanning the horizon. She hadn't asked for leave, hadn't requested rest. She didn't seem to need it. She was part of the landscape now, as constant as the rocks and the dust. Hale stood watching her for a long time, the weight of command pressing heavy on his chest. He knew the enemy would come again, harder, more desperate. And when they did, she would be ready. But would he? Because the longer Lena Carter stayed in this war, the more Hale began to fear, not that she would die, but that she might never be able to live outside of it. The silence that followed the firefight was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't the silence of expectation, of waiting for an enemy to move or a shot to be fired. This silence was heavier, stained with the residue of battle, carrying the weight of men lost and the knowledge that nothing could ever be the same again. The wind moved lazily through the broken village, tugging at torn banners, swaying the remnants of shattered doors, and carrying the faint metallic scent of blood that clung stubbornly to the rubble. Commander Rourke walked slowly through the ruins, his boots grinding over broken stone and dust, his eyes moving from the shattered walls to the faces of the survivors. They were men who had followed him through fire and steel, men who trusted his command, and yet he felt as though each one looked back at him now with questions that words could never answer. How had they survived? How had so few endured? And most of all, why them and not the others? Kara stood apart from them as she often did. Her rifle was slung across her shoulder, the long barrel still streaked with dirt from the ledge where she had lain for so many hours, her body taut with the discipline of her craft. She was not one of them in the way soldiers were, bound by rank and regulation, yet she was something more, an axis around which their survival had turned. Rourke watched her from a distance, wondering how one so young could bear the knowledge of what she had done. 3,247 meters. A number etched in his memory as clearly as a wound, a number that carried not just the pride of accomplishment but the unbearable gravity of what it meant. She had pulled the trigger and a man had ceased to exist. A man who might have been giving orders to kill them all. A man who, had he lived, could have destroyed everything they were fighting to protect. But still, he had been a man, and now the only proof of his existence lay in the memory of a bullet's path through the desert wind. The men had begun to speak of her in hushed tones, as if she were not quite one of them, not quite of this world at all. Some called her a ghost, others an omen. They whispered that no one could make a shot like that without something beyond human sight guiding their hand. Rourke dismissed the talk when he heard it, but in the quiet hours, he found himself haunted by the same question. Was it skill? Was it fate? Or was it something darker, a gift that carried as much curse as blessing? Kara never spoke of it, never sought recognition, never boasted of the record she had unknowingly set. When a younger soldier had asked her about it, she had only shrugged, her eyes cold and distant, as though the number meant nothing. Yet Rourke knew it weighed on her, even if she refused to let it show. That evening, as the campfires burned low and the men tried to stitch their shattered spirits together with small jokes and quiet songs, Rourke found her seated at the edge of the perimeter, staring out into the endless black of the desert. Her rifle rested across her knees, her hands loose upon the weapon, not holding it with the tension of readiness but with something closer to reverence, as though it were a burden she could not put down. He approached without a sound, but she did not turn, did not startle. It was as if she had known he would come, as if she had felt his presence long before his shadow fell across her. For a long time, he said nothing, only lowered himself to sit beside her, his eyes following hers into the emptiness beyond. "You saved us," he said finally, the words low, almost carried away by the wind. She did not answer, only breathed slowly, her gaze unblinking. "Do you understand what you did?" he pressed, though he wasn't sure if he asked for her sake or his own. At last she turned her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no pride in them, no satisfaction. Only the hollow weight of inevitability. "I stopped him," she said, her voice flat, almost brittle. "That's all." She looked back to the desert, and in that small movement Rourke realized the depth of her silence. She didn't see the record, didn't feel the awe that others carried when they spoke of the shot. To her, it was merely action, a line drawn between life and death, carried out because no one else could have done it. It wasn't glory. It was necessity. The commander studied her face, the faint lines of exhaustion that had no right to live on someone so young, and he wondered how long she could bear such a life. The military had seen its share of snipers, men and women forged in the crucible of patience and precision, but Kara was different. She carried her role not like a badge but like a wound. Every trigger pull carved deeper into her, and though she bore it in silence, he feared the day would come when the weight would become too much. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn notebook he carried, the one he used not for orders or tactical notes but for the things he could not say aloud. He handed it to her without a word. She looked at it for a long moment before opening it, scanning the pages filled with sketches of terrain, fragmented thoughts, and names of the fallen. At the very end he had written the number, 3247. She stared at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she closed the book and gave it back to him. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "Numbers never do." And with that, she stood, slinging her rifle once more, her silhouette cutting against the flicker of distant firelight. Rourke watched her walk back toward the camp, her figure swallowed by the night, and he felt the strange certainty that her path was no longer theirs to shape. She had crossed a threshold few could understand, and though she still fought beside them, she now belonged to a realm beyond simple orders and missions. She was the line between victory and ruin, but at what cost? The desert wind rose, carrying with it the whispers of those who had fallen and the promise of battles yet to come. Rourke sat alone, the silence pressing in once more, and for the first time in his long career, he wondered if survival was truly enough. Perhaps there were victories too costly to claim, and perhaps Kara's record was one of them. But the war did not allow for such doubts, and as the dawn began to break, painting the horizon with a thin line of blood-red light, he stood, knowing that whatever came next, the girl with the rifle would be at its heart, silent, steady, and unyielding. Word of the shot traveled faster than any bullet ever could. In war, rumors moved like wildfire, slipping through trenches, whispered in mess halls, retold in exaggerated fragments until they became legend. By the time the third dawn broke after the battle, Kara's name, though she never spoke it herself, had been carried far beyond the ruined village. Soldiers who had never seen her swore they knew the story, retelling it with reverence as if it were already carved into history. 3,247 meters. It was spoken like a prayer, like a curse, like the tolling of a bell that marked the end of an era. Men at the front clung to it for hope. Men behind the lines shivered at the thought that such an eye watched them from the shadows. At first, Kara ignored it. To her, there had been no miracle, no legend, only wind, breath, and the inevitability of pulling a trigger. But Rourke noticed the change around her. The men now glanced at her differently, not with suspicion as they once had, but with a mixture of awe and distance. She had become untouchable not because of arrogance, but because her deed placed her beyond their understanding. No one wanted to sit too close to her at the fire. No one dared to make a joke at her expense. In their eyes she was no longer Kara, the quiet marksman who ate sparingly and spoke less. She was something else, part myth, part weapon. With legends come enemies. Reports soon reached them that enemy commanders were whispering of her too. Somewhere beyond the horizon, someone had placed a mark upon her life. It was said a bounty had been promised to whoever could find and kill the ghost-eyed sniper of Rourke's company. Entire patrols shifted their routes not for strategy but for fear of her unseen gaze. Armored convoys waited for fog, praying it would shield them from the reach of her barrel. She had become more dangerous in reputation than in act, for though she fired rarely, the threat of her presence reshaped entire fields of battle. Rourke called her into his tent one evening when the camp was quiet. A single lamp glowed between them, shadows stretching across maps scattered on the table. He studied her as she entered, rifle slung as always, eyes steady, expression unreadable. "They're hunting you," he said plainly. "Not us. You." She did not flinch, only lowered her gaze to the maps. "Let them," she said. Her voice was calm, but beneath it Rourke heard something darker, an exhaustion that went deeper than weariness, something carved into her bones. "They'll send their best," he warned. "Not just soldiers. Snipers. Trackers. Men who live for this sort of hunt. You won't always see them before they see you." She met his eyes then, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something sharp beneath the calm. "I'm not afraid of being seen," she replied. "I'm afraid of what happens if I stop looking." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. Kara did not fear death, she feared irrelevance, feared becoming blind while others paid the price. It struck him then that perhaps the war had already taken from her the one thing no one could return, the possibility of living without purpose. She had become her rifle, and her rifle had become her. Within weeks, the proof of the bounty arrived. A patrol returned bloodied and shaken, dragging with them the body of an enemy sniper, his face painted in the same muted streaks Kara wore, his pack filled with charts and notes. Pages of calculations revealed distances, wind patterns, sight lines, all centered on the possibility of countering her. She was no longer a ghost. She was prey. The soldiers whispered of it around the fires, fear threading through their voices. Some said it was only a matter of time before another like her emerged on the opposite side, a rival sniper who would stalk her across the wasteland, a duel written in inevitability. Others claimed she could not be killed, that she was more spirit than flesh. Kara heard none of it, or at least she never acknowledged it. She cleaned her rifle each night, checked her scope, and took her place at the perimeter before dawn. To her, the war did not change simply because her name had taken on weight. Targets were targets. Wind was wind. Pulling the trigger remained the same. But Rourke saw the shift in her shoulders, the quiet glances she now gave to the horizon. She slept less, ate less, and when she did speak, her words were colder, sharper. The men began to draw strength from her presence not as a comrade, but as a symbol. She was no longer simply among them, she was something they carried forward like a banner. That burden, Rourke knew, could crush even the strongest. The test came one gray morning when a shot rang out from the dunes. It was distant but unmistakable. A round screamed past the edge of their encampment, slamming into the earth with a hiss of displaced sand. The men scrambled for cover, eyes wide, but Kara did not move. She was already scanning, already measuring the angle, the echo, the shift in the air. Her rifle was on her shoulder in less than a breath, her body motionless as stone. She waited. Seconds stretched like hours. Then, with a calm that seemed inhuman, she squeezed the trigger. The crack of her shot rolled across the desert. Silence followed. No counterfire. No movement. Only the endless wind. When the patrol scouted later, they found the body of another sniper sprawled across the ridge, his scope shattered, his face turned toward the sky. That night, the men spoke of Kara not as though she had survived, but as though she had defied fate itself. Their faith in her grew into something almost holy. But Rourke, watching her sit alone by the fire, knew the truth. Each victory carved deeper into her, hollowing her piece by piece. For every enemy she struck down, some part of her humanity seemed to bleed away, invisible but certain. He wondered how long she could walk that line before there was nothing left but the legend. No girl, no soldier, no Kara. Only the echo of the shot, endless, eternal, stretching farther than any bullet ever had. And he feared, with a weight he could not speak aloud, that when history remembered her, it would not remember the silence she carried, or the life she sacrificed piece by piece. It would remember only the number. 3,247 meters. A record, yes. A marvel, yes. But also a prison from which there was no escape. The desert wind howled again, carrying dust and whispers, and Rourke closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another rifle was already waiting for her. The duel of ghosts had begun. The desert did not sleep, though men tried to. Beneath its vast emptiness, silence thrummed like a heartbeat, steady, relentless. Kara felt it pressing against her each night, louder than any artillery barrage. The wind carried whispers of movement, phantoms in the dunes, imagined or real, she could never tell. But one truth gnawed at her without pause. Somewhere beyond the veil of heat and horizon, her opposite number was waiting. A sniper sent not merely to kill, but to erase her, to reclaim the balance she had shattered with that impossible shot. Every soldier in Rourke's company felt it too. Though they laughed, sang, and argued as soldiers do, there was a tightness to their eyes, a watchfulness that had not been there before. They looked to Kara more often now, as if she could shield them not with her rifle, but with her presence alone. She had become their anchor in a storm of shifting loyalties, the living proof that precision and patience could topple giants. Yet in her solitude, Kara feared what they asked of her. They wanted her not merely to fight, but to endure endlessly, to remain unbroken even as the cracks spread within. The first sign came at dawn. A glint across the dunes, faint as a star. To another it would have been nothing. To Kara, it was a breath held too long, the brief betrayal of glass under sun. She shifted slowly as if even the sand might betray her, and fixed her scope toward the ridge. A mirage shimmered in the heat haze. For half a heartbeat she thought she saw him, a figure prone, the barrel of a rifle jutting like a thorn from the earth. Then the haze swallowed him again. She exhaled, steady. She did not shoot. Patience was their battlefield now. The duel stretched into days. Each morning, each dusk, she felt his presence. A shot never came, nor did she send one. To fire blindly was to waste, and both of them knew it. They circled each other with silence, locked in a chess match measured not in moves but in stillness. At night, she lay awake, hearing her own breath like thunder, wondering if he lay awake as well, his crosshairs drifting over her camp, choosing restraint over revelation. Rourke approached her on the fourth evening. He found her seated on a dune, rifle resting across her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You've seen him," he said softly, though it was no question. "Yes." "Why haven't you taken the shot?" She did not look at him. The dying sun burned copper on her skin. "Because he hasn't taken his." Rourke studied her profile, the sharpness of her gaze. "Then maybe you've already beaten him." She shook her head. "No. He's waiting for me to breathe wrong. Sooner or later I will." That truth lay heavy between them. Rourke wanted to speak of rest, of sharing the burden, but what words could change the laws of her war? She carried it because no one else could. To ask her to step aside was to ask the sun not to rise. He placed a hand on her shoulder, brief but steady. She did not move beneath it, though her silence was answer enough.